I think this is my biggest pet peeve, the thing that just, and this kind of goes along with like overhyped palettes too. Hello my gorgeous ones, welcome to Alicia Budget Beauty. My name is Alicia. Here on my channel, I love all things affordable fashion and beauty. I do hauls, tutorials, reviews, all sorts of fun stuff. So if that sounds good to you, please subscribe, stick around, be a friend. All right, you guys, this is the part 2 I told you I was going to do in the palettes that give me the ick. And in my first video, it was 10 ick factors that keep me from purchasing a new palette. And in this video, I'm going to be telling you 10 ick factors that make me want to declutter my palette. So things while I'm in the mix of using the palettes, it gives me just that ick. I don't want this anymore. So if you want to hear what those are, keep on watching. Now do be sure and go watch the last one. This whole little mini series was inspired by my friend Caitlin and my friend Brittany, and I kind of just melded the two together. Caitlin first thought of the prompt, and she was doing a get ready with me and talking about things that give her the ick about palettes, and she kind of did both in one. She was talking about things when she's using it, things that make her not want to buy a palette. And then my friend Brittany did just the things that made her not want to buy a palette. And I decided to break mine down into 2. So be sure to go watch that other video and go watch theirs as well. Okay, so the number 1, or not the number, this isn't a ranking, this is just topic number 1 of why I would declutter a palette when it gives me the ick, is the mattes are too dry and too powdery. Who likes to use a too dry, powdery matte? I think you all have been there whenever you first stick your brush into the matte and powder starts flying everywhere. Sometimes that's not a deal breaker. One example I'm gonna give is the Sickly Sweet palette from Blend Bunny. That is a very powdery formula in that palette, mainly the pastels, but I don't mind it because they still perform beautifully. That is the difference. If it's gonna perform beautifully, there's things that I can let go, like some fallout, like some powder, but when a matte is too dry and too powdery, it's probably not gonna perform well, and immediately I'm turned off by the palette. Okay, the second ick factor of why I might want to declutter my palette is the mattes are patchy or muddy. I think this is one of my biggest pet peeves, and a palette or brand really that comes to mind right away is Urban Decay. I know I kind of give them a really hard time a lot of the time, but it's kind of because I just don't enjoy their formula all around for most of their palettes. I've not tried some of their newer palettes, but I'm talking like the Naked 2, those type of palettes. I had one and I thought it was supposed to be the greatest thing of all time, because back then there weren't a lot of choices. And I just remember that every time I went into, I remember it was the right side of the palette, those neutrals over there, it was so patchy and muddy on me. And it's generally out here on this outer portion of my eye. And I have these majorly hooded eyes with the brow bone. And a lot of times that's where the muddiness is more likely to happen on myself. And no matter what, when I used the Naked palette, it would always happen to me. And finally, thank goodness, all these other formulas started coming along and I realized, why am I dealing with this patchiness, this muddiness? So that is something that just right away, if I get a new palette and that happens, ick, probably gone. All right, my third ick factor would be no pigment and will not build up. And I guess this could really work for mattes and for shimmers, because sometimes there's really no pigment to a shimmer either. I primarily mean mattes, and I don't mean that every palette has to be bang right out the gate, this ultra saturated pigment. I do like a lot of pigment and saturation to mine. I know some people like that softer formula that will build, and I can appreciate those too. Sometimes those are the most beautiful looks because you don't have those mistakes right out the gate. You don't run into that issue that two mattes may not blend together. So I don't mind if there's not a ton of pigment, but when there's no pigment and you can't build it, and you keep trying to build and it either nothing ever happens or it starts to just look really messy and sloppy, that is an automatic just like, ugh, why am I dealing with this palette? I don't want it. I don't want any further palettes like that. So that is definitely something I would declutter my palette for. Okay, number 4, speaking of shimmers. So if the shimmers are flat or too dry, by flat, I mean, sometimes, I can't stand when this happens. It looks so pretty in a palette, or say their promo pictures on social media or their websites, and you get it, and sometimes right in front of you, it looks really beautiful too, but then when you pick it up and you start putting it on the eye, there's no dimension, there's no ultra sparkle. It just looks like a flat, is it a matte? Is it a shimmer? Well, there's like a little bit of sheen here, but it's just really, really disappointing. Or when it's so dry that it's really, really crumbly and it's flaking off, and it might as well be a pressed glitter, which I know a lot of you, that is an ick factor for you. I saw on Brittany's video, people commenting about pressed glitters being an ick factor. They won't buy a palette with pressed glitters. I think Caitlin said that as well in her video. I don't love a pressed glitter. It's not always a deal breaker for me. If there's one in the palette and the rest of it's really beautiful, I feel like there are certain times and occasions, say a fun Christmas look, a fun New Year's Eve look, where I may use a pressed glitter. Some of them can be decent. For example, this She Glam palettes. I've showed the Sagittarius palette several times in my videos, and it's this green palette, and there is this shimmer glitter hybrid in there that when it's on the lid, it just looks like ultra sparkly, like an indie brand flake formula instead of a cheap glitter formula. So I don't always mind, and I didn't include that in my icks, but when it's a shimmer and it's dry and crumbly like a cheap glitter, I can't stand it. So that is number 4. All right, number 5 is the pigment wears off or creases badly. Honestly, I don't have this happen too often, but one of the examples where I had the pigment wear off, but then I actually learned how to use the palette and I love it now, I'll just bring up because I think it's useful information. It was the Age of Opulence palette by Beauty Bay. And the first time I wore it, looked gorgeous when I left the house. And then within about 15 minutes when I looked in the car mirror, I was like, what is happening? This looks horrible. I used blue and purples in that look. And when you go bold with blue and purple and some of it starts to wear off and doesn't look blended, you look like a crazy person. And that is what I looked like. And I thought, immediate declutter. I'm getting rid of this palette. Then I had some friends who love that formula, love that brand, tell me, you got to try it again, try a different method. And so I since have, and I don't have that issue with that palette anymore. But if I do have that issue with the palette that isn't corrected, I would definitely declutter it. Same thing with too much creasing. I know that's an issue for a lot of aging eyelids. Mine aren't too wrinkly yet. I don't have the issue very often. I know a lot of people with Pat McGrath do have the creasing issue with them. And I just think I prep my skin really, really well. That's why I always kind of look glowy and luminous. It's not because I have the best skin in the world. It's just my prepping. So I think I prep my eyelids pretty well to prevent that from happening. But occasionally there's just a formula out there that no matter what you do, it is just creasy city. And then that's an ick and it's gone. All right, number 6, I think is a pretty obvious one. It's just that the palette literally goes bad. Luckily, I haven't had this happen too often either, but here recently, it was an Ace Beauté palette. I think it was, what was that one called? It was a fall looking palette. It wasn't their fall release that came in Ipsy and BoxyCharm 2 years ago. It was, I cannot remember what it was called. Anyway, I was looking for palettes to declutter. I opened it up and I was like, oh, I still love this color story. I need to use this more. But then right before I closed it, I realized that there was a fuzz that had grown on one of the shimmers. And then one of my friends, Amanda, actually told me that she checked hers afterwards and hers had grown fuzz as well. So there was something about that formula that just wasn't meant to last that long. That is why they put expiration dates on the palettes. However, I think all of us probably have palettes that are years beyond expiration dates, because if it doesn't have fuzz, if it doesn't smell bad, if it still performs well, there's really no reason to get rid of it. But sometimes it does go bad and That's gross. Obviously, that's an ick. All right, then we have formula is outdated. And by that, I mean, it may not have been outdated when I purchased it. Maybe I thought it was really great. So it's definitely one that comes to mind, maybe like my Sigma palettes, my Too Faced palettes. What other brands could I put into this category? It probably would be Urban Decay at one point, but at the time I thought it was really, really nice. I have a BH Cosmetics palette recently. I talked about the BFF palette that I thought this was really good. But then a year later when I try it, it doesn't seem as good. And it's not that anything went bad with the formula. It's just that during that time, you test out other formulas, you try out other palettes, they perform amazing, and you realize, oh, this formula is just a little outdated. They need to, you know, reformulate or something like that. So there's no reason to really keep it in my collection if I have other ones that perform so much better. All right, at number 8 is didn't live up to expectations. This happens to me a lot, I think, where I just, you know, it'd be a lot of hype around something and I just expect it to be amazing. I mean, there's all this hype, it's got to be great. And maybe I have really high standards now. I think the more you try out formulas, obviously it really, you know, hones in on what you like, what you don't like. You compare a lot, whether you want to or not, it just naturally happens. And so, you know, I can admit sometimes that I see that this palette is good. I see that this palette is good for someone who hasn't tried a whole lot, or maybe someone that doesn't want, say, a lot of pigment, or someone that doesn't want a lot of sparkle or shine with their shimmers or their multi-chromes. But for me, if it just doesn't live up to the hype, then I immediately am like, oh, why did I buy into this? And that's one reason why I've been a lot pickier about what I do purchase now. Is I used to just, you know, oh, it's the hyped palette, like everyone's getting that, then I want it too. And now I'm like, I know it could possibly not meet my expectations, and therefore I just won't purchase it. But occasionally I'll cave, I'll get one, doesn't meet my expectations, and it just makes me feel icky. Okay, number 9, this is a big one for me. An expensive palette that performs mediocre. I think this is my biggest pet peeve, the thing that just, and this kind of goes along with like overhyped palettes too, but you know, we only have a certain amount of income we can be spending on makeup. I mean, some people spend more than they should, but when you look at the prices these days of makeup, they've really gone up a whole lot. There are some brands that have worked really hard to keep their prices really reasonable with amazing quality. And I just have a really hard time whenever, you know, sometimes it's mainstream brands, sometimes it's luxury brands, even indie now will hike up their prices so high. And then when you try them, you realize I've got this $20 palette over here that performs just as well, if not better. That really, really, really bugs me. And I think it's been happening a lot lately. Obviously, prices of everything have gone up, whether warranted or not. But at least with makeup, if you're gonna spend, I'd say these days, if you're gonna spend over $40 on a palette, that thing better perform really, really well. And then you've got the palettes now that are up into the $100 to $150, which is just insane to me. But if you go ahead and spend money on a palette like that, there better be no other palette in your entire collection that is as good. And if there are, then that should definitely give you the ick. All right, and the last one, number 10 of things that give me the ick when I'm using palettes and makes me want to declutter would be, I just dread wearing it. And that sounds a little bit silly. Why do you have palettes that you dread wearing? But I think we do this with a lot of things. I think we do this with our clothing, with makeup, with food, that sometimes we choose, like we save the good stuff. We save the things that we love, that really makes us excited for special occasions. And, you know, we're like, oh, I guess I'll wear this old dress or this old shirt I don't like that much. You know, this palette that isn't my favorite. I'm trying to get out of that mentality and think, why am I not using and wearing and enjoying the things that I love the most, that make me the most excited? If I dread wearing it, or if I'm not excited by wearing it, whether it be makeup or clothing, like, why am I gonna wear it? So that's kind of a newer mentality for me, and maybe that'll be a new mentality for you too. And if you go and look through your collection and you think, every time I wear this, I don't love it and I kind of dread wearing it, but I'm still gonna force myself to, maybe it's time to let that one go. All right, you guys, I want to thank Caitlin and Brittany for giving me the idea for this video. This was really fun for me. Hopefully this will maybe help you guys with your spending habits and, you know, what you choose to purchase, what you choose to declutter. Let me know if it did in the comments. And as always, have fun shopping, budget shopping. Bye.